A college student is at home in Texas during winter break in January of 2002. She is nearing the end of her time back home before returning to college. Just like every other morning, the avid runner laced up her shoes, grabbed her Walkman, and headed out on her 4-mile route around her family's sprawling subdivision. Neighbors see her along her jog that morning, and her movements are largely accounted for. In fact, one neighbor places her just a football field's length away from her driveway. But somehow, she never makes it there. Her disappearance would fracture the safety felt in the quiet community. Over the years, there have been various theories, suspects, and even a confession. But to this day, no sign of her has ever turned up, and nobody has been held responsible. I'm your host, Megan, and each week on A Simpler Time True Crime, I cover older unsolved cases and challenge the idea that a simpler time means a safer time. This week, I'm bringing to you the unsolved disappearance of Rachel Louise Cooke. This week's case is from January of 2002. Just like the case I covered last episode, Dr. Cheryl Lamont Pearson went missing from Bartlett, Tennessee on January 5th, 2002. And today's case, that of Rachel Cooke, well, Rachel went missing on January 10th, 2002 in Georgetown, Texas. Now, I'm not mentioning it because these two cases are related. But I do recognize that these ones are both on the more recent side of the cases I cover on this podcast, and the good old days theme may not resonate with you as much when I'm talking about cases that feel like, well, at least to me, almost like yesterday in a sense. But talking about these two cases is by design, because they occur in this transition time. DNA technology was advancing quickly, but it was nowhere near where it is today. Surveillance cameras existed, but very few people had them on their homes and certainly not streaming live into their phones. Cell phones were around, but they were bulky flip phones, not constant companions, and the data they provided was limited. There were ways to get the word out about missing persons cases, but social media hadn't yet become the powerful tool it is now. It wasn't the centralized hub for awareness, tips, and pressure that we see in modern cases. So as we get into Rachel's story, I want you to keep that context in mind. And real quickly, before I share her case, I want to acknowledge that much of what I'm able to share in this case, I have to credit to the original reporting done in the Austin American-Statesman newspaper. I will link all of that in the show notes, so let's get into it. It was around 8 a.m. on Thursday, January 10th, 2002. In Georgetown, Texas, high school art teacher Janet Cooke took a moment to glance over at the couch, where her 19-year-old daughter Rachel was still sleeping. Rachel was home on an extended winter break from college. Rachel had grown up and attended school in Georgetown, Texas, a city of about 100,000 people near Austin, about 30 miles to the north. It's one of those places with a picturesque town square full of charm that could just land on a postcard. And if you were to Google best places to raise a family near Austin, Georgetown would come up. I'm not just saying that, I know because I even tested it out. Rachel was the older of the two Cooke daughters. Her sister Joanne was 2 years younger. Her father Robert worked at IBM in Austin, and the Cookes resided in the North Lake subdivision in Texas. Now, when I picture a subdivision, I tend to think of housing tracts where houses are very close together, and that is not at all the case here. I'll have some Google street photos on Instagram so you can get a feel for yourself, but this neighborhood had houses set often on 1 to 3 acres of land that had woods surrounding it, a lot of trees, a lot of horse people in the area with stables and lots of land. The subdivision itself was surrounded by cattle ranches. A lot of the houses are set back off the road with long driveways. Rachel loved to run. In high school, she made all-state and cross-country. And so when she was home, she had taken a run almost every day while on break. She was home on break from Mesa Junior College in San Diego. Her mother would later say that Rachel moved to California because she loved the sun. She loved being on the beach, and she was a vegetarian, and her mother laughed and said that Rachel thought everyone in California would be a vegetarian. She had hopes of doing some undergraduate work at this college and then transferring to a 4-year school to pursue a career in fashion design. Initially, when Rachel had moved to California, she was still dating her high school boyfriend Thomas, but she broke that off pretty quickly. Rachel wanted to experience her new city and life of freedom. Her boyfriend, who still lived back in Texas, took the breakup pretty hard. Rachel was really enjoying herself out there. Just like when she was in Texas, she had some waitressing gigs in San Diego, and she also worked at a bakery. One article talked about how when she would go home from the bakery, she would take some of the leftover baked goods and deliver them to people who were unhoused around the city. She was just really thoughtful like that. After being in San Diego for just a short while, she met a new boyfriend who she got serious with fast. His name was Greg, and they fell hard for each other. He even came out to Texas with her when she flew home for the holidays. After the year 2002 rang in, Greg flew back to California separately because he had to get back to work. Rachel was staying in town for a bit longer until the semester started, in part because she was going to her cousin's wedding on Saturday, January 12th. That would be her last event in town before flying back on Sunday the 13th to return to San Diego. So on this morning, as her parents left for work, Rachel wasn't quite up yet, but would be soon. Early that morning, sometime a little after 9 a.m. Austin, Texas time, and a little after 7 a.m. San Diego time, Greg called Rachel and they spoke briefly, and cell phone records back this up. She let him know she was going to head out for her typical morning run, and that she'd call him back later when she got back. But her phone call to Greg would never come. Rachel put on a gray running outfit, a shirt and shorts, and a green sports bra. She laced up her white Asics sneakers and grabbed her bright yellow Sony Walkman and sports headphones. And off she went. Rachel's movements are well accounted for on this jog. The neighborhood still had new build homes going up, and there was construction crews in the neighborhood and a decent amount of cars in traffic, which was surprising to me because if you look at the pictures of how the neighborhood is set up, I was surprised to find out that there's a decent amount of through traffic. Neighbors at different parts of the neighborhood all saw her jogging past at different times. And then at around 10:30 a.m., the last set of neighbors saw Rachel. She had begun shifting from a jog down to a walk as part of her cool down. Depending on the source material, Rachel was anywhere from 100 to 300 yards from her driveway at this point. And then she vanished. Greg never did receive his phone call, but he wasn't immediately alarmed. Rachel could have gotten distracted, and it's not like everyone was texting each other regularly at this point or in as much contact as we are now. But the first concern that was felt was that of Robert Cooke, Rachel's father. He left work early on that Thursday because he and Rachel had plans to go shopping that afternoon. He was even more alarmed that her purse and cell phone were still at the house, but there were no other signs of Rachel being there. When Janet returned home from work, Robert and Janet talked through that maybe Rachel had picked up a shift at the restaurant she worked at. She worked at this one restaurant prior to going away to college, and they kept her on the books even after she moved so that she could still work shifts while she was in town. So when Janet called the establishment and asked, "Is Rachel working?" they breathed a collective sigh of relief when she said, "Yes, Rachel's here." They figured that she must have just accidentally left some of her stuff behind and would be getting a ride home later. But when Rachel didn't come home at all that night, They grew worried and called the restaurant the next day. And that's when they got the gut punch. Rachel being a somewhat common name, the person who had been on the phone had indeed seen a Rachel working that night, but it wasn't Rachel Cooke. It was a different Rachel. Panic set in full force because now, not only did they not know where Rachel was, they had lost precious time looking for her. The Cookes called police, and the Williamson County Sheriff's Department was first on the case. At first, their response was a bit lukewarm. There were certainly things to be concerned about, like Rachel's belongings being left behind, and this being totally out of character for her. But you know how it goes, sometimes still, but especially back then. She's 19, she's an adult, she's home on break, she probably is just visiting with friends, she lost track of time, she's allowed to do that because she's an adult. What's difficult is when we hear about these cases on podcasts and true crime shows, 100% of the time, these cases that we're seeing, there is something seriously wrong. And so you want to shout out, why didn't you take this seriously? But in defense of law enforcement, that statistic doesn't ring true for them. In their day-to-day, they are getting a lot of calls about someone who just walked off or didn't stay in touch with their family, and ultimately, for the most part, they return. But in this case, there were so many alarming things from the jump that I don't give as much grace for the slow start. The Cookes were aggressive in their search, starting right out on that Friday, driving around, calling friends, looking everywhere. And to their credit, police did jump in fairly quickly after. Especially when on Saturday, Rachel was not back for her cousin's wedding. The wedding went on as scheduled, but a special moment of prayer was held for Rachel, and her disappearance certainly carried a cloud of worry and grief at the event. The initial searches poured over the sprawling rural areas surrounding Rachel's neighborhood and into nearby Russell Park. Russell Park is about 4 miles outside of Rachel's neighborhood, but there's a lot of wilderness in that area, and it backs up to Georgetown Lake. Throughout the weekend, the search crews grew, both people in the community and law enforcement. The Department of Public Safety searched by helicopter, and the Sheriff's Department used scent tracking dogs. On Sunday, the Texas Rangers were called in, along with a civilian search party, and over 100 volunteers showed up. Sergeant Michael Loomis told the Austin American-Statesman, quote, "I saw volunteers stand for 2 hours waiting for assignment. They're very dedicated," end quote. The neighbors in the North Lake subdivision wanted to help in any way possible, even offering up their own horses to help the search of the rugged terrain. And it really was. In fact, early on, just a couple of days into the search, an 18-year-old man was seriously injured when he slipped and fell 20 feet down an embankment while trying to help with the search. Despite the dangers, people carried on. 50 of Robert's colleagues from IBM joined on the search. Searches were conducted on ATVs, and still nothing. The Cookes were grateful for the support of everyone. Janet told the paper, quote, "All these people being here, it helps. It helps enormously. We don't feel alone going through this. The waiting is the most difficult," end quote. Rachel's sister Joanne and her parents, Robert and Janet, stayed close to their home on Navajo Trail, waiting for updates. Joanne told the papers that she hoped whoever kidnapped her sister was being kind to her and that he returned her home unharmed. She said, quote, "Everybody's pretty sure we're going to find her," end quote. Joanne would have no idea in that moment, just days into her sister going missing, how much she would need to hold out that hope, and how unending the search for answers would be. While combing the area doing physical searches, detectives working the case also had to look into who might be behind this and question the people closest to Rachel in her life. Now, outside of online discussion boards, there isn't a lot of places that talk specifically about Rachel's ex-boyfriend from high school, Thomas. But in an episode of the Investigation Discovery TV program Disappeared, as well as interviews on Crime Watch Daily, he is described as not taking the breakup well and becoming very hostile. He would call often against Rachel's wishes, even at one point necessitating intervention from Rachel's new boyfriend, Greg. Greg told Crime Watch Daily that Thomas didn't seem in control of his emotions, and he was even sobbing in a phone call to Greg about him missing Rachel. Greg also had become irate that Rachel would not speak to him or visit with him while she was home on break, and the fact that she had drawn boundaries. And at one point, he showed up uninvited to a party she was at over that holiday break. According to Greg, that did not go well and ended up with Rachel and Thomas getting into a serious verbal altercation. Now, we know statistics show that people are much more often victims of crime at the hands of people they know and whom they are close to rather than a random stranger. So could he have been waiting for her in the driveway when she got back from her run and then in a fit of rage abducted her? Rachel's father, Robert, had written in one of his diaries where he tracked the case that he had given a list of friends and Rachel's ex-boyfriends to the detectives. And so it's understood that investigators have likely spoken to him over the years. But what came of those conversations, if he took a polygraph test or if he had an alibi, that's never been released. What we do know is that to this day, at the time of this recording, he hasn't been eliminated as a person of interest in the case. And unfortunately, that's all the information I have on him. Now, what about a stranger lurking back at the house? It is possible. According to Robert, they did keep their doors unlocked, as did most of the people in the neighborhood at that time. So could someone have seen Rachel leave to go out on her jog, gone inside, and had been waiting for her? That can't be ruled out, but there weren't any signs of a struggle or any indication that she had come back. But I mean, if someone was waiting right inside the doorway with a weapon and was just waiting to abduct her, that is possible. And truthfully, that could have been someone she knew or a stranger. That doesn't necessarily make it immediately a stranger. So let's talk about family. This is going to be one of those instances where I jump around in the timeline a bit, but I think it's important to tie this off once and for all to better focus for the rest of the episode. There was some controversy on this case because, according to the first detectives who worked the case, the original sheriff to investigate, a man named John Maspero, stated that those working the Cooke case that they were not to question the family as potential suspects. Now, besides just deviating from standard investigative practice, it's also cloudy because this sheriff knew Janet Cooke and the family dating back to growing up in Georgetown together, even going to kindergarten together. And look, no family wants time wasted on them when they know the real perpetrator is out there. But it is important as a step, and even if ultimately it rules them out as suspects, which is a good thing, the conversations often lead the police on a promising path to follow up on new clues. So here's what I'll say. This wasn't best police practice from everything I know, and Rachel's case has been passed through several different sheriffs in office. And later on, her family would be questioned and polygraphed. And her father, Robert, he actually failed the polygraph because of one question. The question was, "Do you know where Rachel is?" And he said no, and he failed. But Janet Cooke and the family, they were pretty quick to have an explanation. You see, by the time Robert was polygraphed, he was pretty certain that his beautiful daughter had been murdered, and it was his belief that she was in heaven. So when asked, he answered no because he didn't know where her physical remains were. But in his heart, he had a belief about where her soul was. Police were asked by Crime Watch Daily if they believed this, and they say yes, there is absolutely nothing to point in the direction of Robert Cooke. He was at work at the time of her disappearance, and as such, Rachel's family is not considered suspects in her disappearance whatsoever. And so then there are the eyewitness accounts of what was seen in the neighborhood that morning. Vehicles in composite sketches end up being a significant clue in this case. Several witnesses came forward to report a white vehicle in the neighborhood that seemed out of place, and that this vehicle had men in it who may have been seen speaking to a woman who matched Rachel's description. It was a late model white car, possibly a Chevy Camaro or Pontiac Trans Am with a black stripe towards the bottom. The driver was described as possibly a Hispanic male, dark complexion, slicked back black hair, and that there was another man seen in that vehicle as well. This came out early on, so police worked with the witnesses to do a composite sketch, and so that was drawn up, and this information was shared with the media. And this kind of brings us back to the contemporaneous flow and timeline of the investigation. On January 17th, investigators asked the public to come forward with anything they think could be relevant, even if they're second-guessing the significance of it. And the following day, on January 18th, a $10,000 reward was announced for information on Rachel's disappearance. And on that same day, search and rescue organization Texas EquiSearch was brought in. This would be the beginning of a long-standing relationship between the Cooke family and Tim Miller, the founder of Texas EquiSearch, who knew all too well what the Cooke family was going through. Tim founded Texas EquiSearch in 2000 as a way of giving back and helping other families of missing persons after his teen daughter Laura Miller disappeared in 1984 while walking home after using a payphone nearby to his home. Laura was later found murdered, a victim in a string of homicides off Interstate 45 between Houston and Galveston. Dubbed the Texas Killing Fields, it's thought that the bodies found in these fields are the result of multiple serial killers over several decades. Tim Miller has his demons. He wrongfully pursued who he thought was his daughter's killer, a property owner where her body was found, for years, harassing him and ultimately ruining the man's life before he was definitively ruled out in her murder. Tim owns up to this now and states that due to his own actions and behavior towards this innocent man, he was a secondary victim in all of it. But unfortunately, that man passed away very tragically. But that is in part why Tim founded this organization, to give back and do differently, and help parents to process differently than he did. His organization has helped locate so many people over the years, and when he came into town, not only was his organization conducting a massive 50 square mile search for Rachel, he personally was checking in on the well-being of the Cookes and providing emotional support. Texas EquiSearch did a 2-week comprehensive search but came up with nothing. They had to leave on February 1st to assist in another missing persons case. However, Tim Miller would continue to stay in close contact with the Cooke family for years to come and even collaborate on some initiatives with them, particularly Rachel's father, Robert. Tim could understand the feelings that Robert was feeling, which was a lot of guilt and a failure to protect, which is how he felt about his own daughter. In fact, Robert himself became involved with Texas EquiSearch, and he would later lend a hand to high-profile investigations like the Natalie Holloway case, while always keeping Rachel at the forefront. By the end of January, the reward was bumped up to $25,000, and on February 10th, the Cooke family had a message to mark the 1-month anniversary of their daughter going missing. Titled A Heartfelt Thank You, it read, "How do you say thank you to so many who have given so much? There are no words. Since January 10th, you have fed, hugged, laughed, and cried with us. You have rallied, walked, ridden, and prayed with us. To know and experience this outpouring of love for Rachel fills our hearts with courage and the strength to continue. Our mission is not over, and it is comforting to know that you are there should we need you. Somehow, somewhere, there is someone or something that will show the way and bring Rachel home. We will not give up until that day comes. So this thank you, inadequate as it is not a door closing, but a declaration of hope and a renewal of strength. We ask your continued prayers for Rachel's return to us." Signed, Robert, Janet, and Joanne Cooke. And the community was not giving up. At the end of February, Robert's colleagues at IBM inspired an idea for the Ride for Rachel. People on their motorcycles rode out to places like College Station, Corpus Christi, and Fredericksburg to distribute flyers about Rachel to businesses and get her face everywhere. Rachel's family began organizing with community partners to offer self-defense classes, something that would go on for years. And in April of 2002, an honorary 5K was held for Rachel, with all proceeds going to her reward fund. In May, police released more information about the composite sketch. They shared that the person in the white vehicle was indeed believed to have been talking to Rachel that day. You'll see in a lot of publications that Rachel was seen on FM 3405 in Georgetown, and this is North Lake Road, the main road that her subdivision is located off of. And that's the area she was seen speaking to these men. They also mentioned that at this time a white pickup truck also possibly was seen in the area, and they were interested in speaking to the person driving it because that driver was also said to have been speaking with Rachel. So I don't know if that means that the people in the car and the truck, if they were all involved or it was two totally separate interactions. At the 6-month mark in July, Rachel's Aunt Elaine spoke on behalf of the family with the following message to the community. On Wednesday, Robert and Janet Cooke will face yet another sad milestone, 6 months since their beautiful daughter, Rachel Cooke, my niece, went jogging and never returned. Please join our family in a moment of silence at 11:30 a.m. Wednesday. If you are unable to observe this special moment, I ask that you remember Rachel in your own way. Turn on your headlights or tie a yellow ribbon on your antenna, hug your children. Never forget that whoever took Rachel is still out there. Rachel's family will be starting a website in her honor, rachelalert.org. It will alert law enforcement, media, and search organizations to a possible abduction within the first 48 hours. It will not discriminate according to missing person's age, location, race, family income, or sex. Our family found out January 10th that age discrimination occurs when someone is reported missing. The fact that Rachel was 19 when she disappeared made a difference in how her case was handled. End quote. Just a couple weeks after that, police in Georgetown, the Williamson County Sheriff's Department, they did start using a software program, and it allowed them to notify 76 law enforcement agencies and media outlets in a 100-mile radius in missing persons cases. And it wasn't just things like abductions, it was for things like missing vulnerable adults as well and elderly people. And it was named in Rachel's honor. By October, Janet and Robert joined Tim Miller to meet with President Bush at the White House about missing persons cases. I can't even imagine how disorienting it was to have their daughter happily off in college in October of 2001, and then by that time, just a year later, they're at the White House advocating for missing persons cases. That has to just be wild. Robert Cooke had very targeted reasons for his advocacy. He said that he was hoping to encourage authorities to create a state or federal task force, including the FBI, U.S. Marshals, and local law enforcement officers to work together on missing children's cases. He also wanted to again focus on that age discrimination and make sure that just because someone is 19, like his daughter was, that they don't get kind of pushed to the wayside or taken less seriously. Later that month, Rachel's case would be featured on The John Walsh Show. By November, the reward in Rachel's case had been raised to $50,000, and her parents put a message out to Texas hunters to be on the lookout for anything. Because hunters would now be entering areas that hadn't been previously searched, they told those hunting to check often vacant places like their hunting cabins or unused structures to report any foul odors or any suspicious activity. But the 1-year anniversary would come and hit with no new evidence in the case. In April of 2003, the Cooke family and the Georgetown community all held their breaths as it was announced that remains were found 10 miles outside of where Rachel was last seen. 2 teen boys hitting golf balls stumbled into the remains in a culvert. Rachel's father, Robert, talked about how there'd been other instances where remains had been found, but they had all been 50-plus miles away. This felt closer to home. It was at this point that the family opened up about how difficult this was on them. They would have trouble sleeping, and every time the phone rang, they got anxiety. One thing that can sometimes be assumed is that a family is all handling something like this in the same way, or that they're at least on the same page. But that's actually rarely the case. As humans, we're all wired to handle life differently, and there's no playbook for how you'll respond to something as tragic and traumatic as this. So Robert poured himself into every possible way he could take in finding answers, understandably almost obsessive. Janet was also regularly engaging with the media and searchers and talked about how she thought of her daughter hundreds of times a day, but sometimes she needed a break from the constant pursuit of those answers. And in years following, Joanne would talk about how sometimes she didn't even want the answers because as painful as it was not knowing, knowing would mean hearing all those details and having her heart broken. All of these responses are just how people show up, and it's normal. And there's nothing wrong with handling things all differently. The remains turned out to not be those of Rachel, but of another missing man named Charles Kelsey. In January of 2004, at the 2-year mark of Rachel's disappearance, a new sheriff named Jim Wilson took over, and on the second day on the job, he announced that he was pulling together a multi-agency task force to look into Rachel's disappearance. It was made up of 10 members from the Austin Police Department's cold case team, a representative from the FBI's Violent Crimes Task Force, a retired FBI agent, a member of the Georgetown Police Department, members of the Sheriff's Department, and Texas Rangers. They planned to take several months to review the entire case from scratch and pore through all previously collected statements with friends, family, neighbors, witnesses, you name it. And then in most cases, re-interview, look for inconsistencies in statements. The sheriff noted that most of the time people are able to keep their stories straight when they're telling the truth, but it's harder when you have to keep your story up. They hit the ground running. By May, the sheriff provided a task force update sharing that over 1,000 man-hours had been devoted to the case, and they'd interviewed 100 people. After that, things seemed to fade and slow down a little bit, but in reality, there was still a ton happening behind the scenes. There is a bit of mixed reporting on the way in which this next suspect came in contact with the cold case team looking into Rachel Cooke's case. Some source material says that investigators were looking for murderers in the area who were now in prison and who had been out at the time of Rachel's case, who may have had a similar MO, and that they came across this suspect and began asking about Rachel's case. Other sources say this suspect contacted investigators himself and just began talking about Rachel. Either way, what we do know is that behind the scenes, in August of 2006, a convicted murderer named Michael Keith Moore confessed in a recorded jail interview to the murder of Rachel Cooke. Just as a content warning, this next part where I talk about the confession and Moore's previous crimes, they do have some graphic content, so please take care when listening. Moore told investigators that he happened to be out on the day of Rachel's disappearance. He was looking for a business to burglarize, and he just happened to see Rachel jogging. He said he drove ahead and parked his truck. He stayed near his truck and mimicked being a jogger himself. When Rachel ran past him in the opposite direction, he turned around and came up behind her and struck her with a claw hammer. He then abducted her, took her to a second location where he sexually assaulted her, and then allegedly bludgeoned her and possibly suffocated her. He said he then wrapped her body in a tarp and attached rocks to weigh it down. He drove to the Gulf Coast near the Matagorda Bay, where he dropped her body into the water. He also mentioned burying some of her personal belongings. Police secured this confession, but they didn't want to go to court with just that. So they took Michael Moore out and had him recreate where he had been, how he had done it, drove to where he had dumped the body, and spent a considerable amount of time on cross-referencing his story and the details so that they had a sound case. It would take until November, but on Thursday, November 9th, in a press conference, police announced they had arrested Michael Keith Moore in Rachel's case. The following day would be his arraignment, and they announced that they had reached a plea deal. Moore would plead guilty and lead investigators to where he discarded Rachel's belongings and show where her body was located exactly, in exchange for a life sentence and the death penalty being taken off the table. Rachel's family, loved ones, friends, and community members packed into the courtroom on November 10th, 2006. But the next exchange would leave everyone speechless. District Judge Bert Carnes said to Moore, "How do you plead?" And Michael Moore said, "Not guilty." Carnes said, "Could you repeat that for me, please?" And again, "Not guilty." Rachel's family felt victimized all over again. Moore's defense attorneys tried for hours to talk to him to rework the deal, but he refused. As a result, the state had to drop the murder charges in order to continue their investigation and give the option to bring forth charges in the future. This created a whole new wound in the Georgetown community and opened up deeper scrutiny on the life of Michael Keith Moore. I personally don't like to focus these episodes on coward perpetrators at all, but I do want to focus on a bit of his psychology and criminal profile and criminal history for a moment, because as of today, his involvement as a suspect is still highly debated. Many think he was truly guilty, but there just wasn't enough evidence and he's toying with investigators and the family. And others believe he was toying from the get-go and that he never had anything to do with this case. And all of this is brought to you by a deep dive in the Austin American-Statesman on Moore's history. It came from an article titled "The Violent Past of an Icy Killer," and it was published in late November of 2006. Michael began crimes as a juvenile, and that was reported on by his father. His father said he was always getting into trouble. He once shoplifted, and his father made him bring back everything in front of the store owners and customers, and Michael didn't care whatsoever. In his early 20s, he was arrested for criminal mischief for breaking car windows and destroying property, seemingly just because. He got light sentencing for that, 60 days in jail served on weekends. He then had multiple arrests for domestic violence of his wife. And then he had weapons charges, repeatedly carrying a knife on him, even though this was against his parole conditions. After this, in the late 90s and early 2000s, the allegations around his inappropriate sexual behavior ramp up. Someone uses his phone to say she is being sexually assaulted, but then hangs up. This was a 911 call, and that's in November of 2001. When police question him about this, he denies it, and then he changes his story and says that he placed the call, but he was calling because he had been choking, which doesn't even make sense. He actually would face charges for filing a false police report for that call, but those charges were later dropped, and they never could figure out who that woman was. On December 21st, 2001, just weeks before Rachel's disappearance, a young teen in a town about 50 miles away from Georgetown returned home around 10 p.m. and pulled in her driveway. A pickup truck had been following her and pulled up behind her, with a man matching Moore's description getting out and striking up a conversation. He then attempted to grab her, but she was able to get away and run inside her house. He was and is still considered a likely suspect in that interaction. Over the next year or so, there are several allegations of Moore attempting sexual assault at college parties across Georgetown. The only thing that really seems to stick is providing alcohol to minors. Then things really escalate. In September of 2003, Moore breaks into the home of a young mother named Christina Moore. She had her toddler home with her at the time, and she was pregnant with her second baby. He is no relation to Christina Moore, but he supposedly chose her house to steal checks and other items because he felt it would be easier to forge and get away with using those documents since he had the same last name. As Christina Moore begged for her life, he slit her throat and left her to die. Her husband came home to find his wife dead and his toddler wandering around the house. I mean, this guy is just pure evil. But one thing besides evil is that, according to his own father and those who profile criminals like him, Moore is of average, possibly even below average intelligence, but he thinks he's the smartest person in the room, which is maybe why he anonymously phoned police from a payphone just 4 days after the murder to tell police he had found checks bearing Christina's name in a payphone coin return slot. This was somewhat his undoing. That phone call was recorded, so they had his voice, and his predatory sexual behavior would not stop. You see, he has a host of inappropriate sexual activity, including but not limited to the following: secretly photographing women in public and writing down their license plate numbers, writing sexually inappropriate letters from prison to his teenage stepdaughter, masturbating in front of female inmates at the Williamson County Jail Infirmary, which ended up costing the county about $60,000 in a settlement with the 3 women. He also threatened to kill a female inmate if she ever told authorities that he had found a way to leave his infirmary cell. And then a break came in February of 2004 when Michael Moore's stepdaughter-in-law approached sheriff deputies and said she wanted to discuss Moore breaking into her home. She was sleeping overnight, and he broke into her home and started rubbing her leg and touching her inappropriately. While she was talking, she mentioned that Moore once claimed to have possessed checks bearing Christina Moore's name. That made detectives decide to play the audio tape for her of this so-called anonymous caller, and she right away identified the voice as that of Michael Moore's. 2 days later, police began questioning Moore about the murder, and he really tried to dodge it at first, but there was no coming back from it. In November of 2004, he was indicted on charges of capital murder, felony murder, aggravated robbery, and aggravated kidnapping in connection with Christina Moore's death. It took a while, actually, for the trial to get started. It was February of 2006, but a Williamson County jury ended up acquitting Michael Moore of the capital murder, but they convicted him of felony murder, aggravated robbery, and aggravated kidnapping after deliberating for more than 17 hours over 2 days. It was actually the first death penalty case where the Williamson County prosecution had lost the death penalty aspect, but he did end up getting sentenced in a way that gave him 4 concurrent life sentences. Moore's father did not defend his son whatsoever in that article in November of 2006 to the paper. He said one time they tried to get a psych eval for him, but he fled the facility before he could be diagnosed. Ronald Moore told the Austin American-Statesman, quote, "He has no guilt on anything he does. He never has. And he can stand in front of you and lie to you. And you cannot tell whether he's telling the truth or lying. You stand up for your kids. You stand up for them. But there's got to be a point when you say no more. I reached that point. He's in prison where he belongs." End quote. Michael Keith Moore took exception to this article. He ended up contacting the Austin American-Statesman via a scathing letter and they said, "We'd be happy to sit down and hear your side." He declined, then he reached back out, he scheduled a time to meet with them, then he backed out the day of, the usual control stuff and toying with people. But finally, in June 2007, he would sit down. In this exclusive jailhouse interview, he told the paper that he duped investigators. He was getting special treatment in prison. He was getting extra visits with his ex-wife, having prison infractions wiped off his record, all sorts of things, as long as he cooperated, including getting driven around to see the coast and get out of his jail cell. And then he began to mock the police a bit. He said they should have picked up on the inconsistencies in his story. He said he was known to burglarize unoccupied businesses, so his story wouldn't even make sense, he said, to be out looking for a business to rob since most businesses would have been open at that time. And how did he make believe he was jogging in street clothes or hide a hammer behind his back, he said. He then ended by saying he felt bad for the Cookes. He told the paper, quote, "I can imagine them thinking their daughter, their loved one, just disappeared again right there in court. That's what I feel bad about. He also said he changed his plea because he couldn't bear to think of helping someone get away with murder. The district attorney scoffed at this and said, quote, "I would note that Michael Keith Moore is serving 4 life sentences, is a psychopathic killer, a proven pathological liar, and has repeatedly used the media to manipulate his circumstances. It would appear to me that he is attempting to manipulate the media once again." End quote. Rachel's father agreed and said that he didn't think that Michael cared whatsoever about his family that had fractured as the years went on. Rachel's disappearance would ruin the marriage of Janet and Robert. He would end up taking a new job up in Albany, New York, while still spending all of his free time on Rachel's case. Most of all, the family was now profoundly worried of the collateral damage to the confession and recanting of that confession. To some degree, in the eyes of public opinion, the case was solved but just couldn't be proven. But the Cookes were not convinced that Moore killed their daughter, and they did not want the community or police to stop looking into their daughter's case. They did feel that law enforcement was still convinced of Moore's guilt, and that for years it impeded the progress they made in their daughter's case. Robert Cooke purchased a billboard in 2008 and tried to keep eyes on the progress, and then he began to get quite ill. He vowed he would spend his whole rest of his life finding answers if need be, and that's just what he did. But sadly, he would go to his grave without them. Robert died after a long illness in 2014 at just 59 years old. According to Williamson County sheriffs, even though the case would grow cold, it would never close, and they always got tips, but nothing like in the beginning. So, for example, at the end of 2016, they shared that they had had 16 tips to follow up on that year. In December of 2016, investigators announced they had a forensic lead to follow down related to a vehicle and only described it as, quote, "a large amount of new material." In December of 2017, another task force was put together and a new reward in the case offered, leaving the case at a $100,000 reward for info, $50,000 from the family, and $50,000 put up by law enforcement. In 2018, more info was released on the 2016 forensics. Investigators shared that they recovered a 1998 Pontiac Trans Am tied to potential persons of interest in Rachel's case, which you have to assume is that Trans Am spotted that day. Does this mean that for a while now, police have had suspects under their noses and they just can't tie the evidence to them? Maybe. It was said to be about 3 or 4 potential suspects. In 2018, they shared that preliminary testing revealed the possible presence of blood on the passenger floorboard and door of that car. But at this point, nothing more has come of that. So it's possible they don't have enough of a case or that forensics aren't far along enough at this very moment to do more with what they found. But it does bring some hope. This was the last major break in the case, but Rachel's memory is never far from the minds of the Georgetown community or her mother, sister, and other loved ones still holding out hope for answers. Did an ex-boyfriend of Rachel have a deadly argument with her that day? What can be done to rule him in or out once and for all? Was Michael Keith Moore truly involved? If so, the clock is slowly ticking away. Those 4 life sentences he received in the murder case are served concurrently, and the 50-year-old will be up for parole in December of 2034. On one hand, it's not unheard of for people looking for attention or looking to manipulate or just to get outside of prison walls to lie about something like this. But keep in mind that he was connected to attempted abductions. He did have deviant sexual behavior and a problematic sexual history. And this is just my observation, but the murder victim, even though Christina was just supposedly because she had the same last name and it was easy enough to use her name and stolen identity, my personal observation is that she looked a lot like Rachel Cooke. Was there any connection to construction workers that were working in the neighborhood, which could have really just been someone passing through? And what about those persons of interest related to the white Trans Am? If there are multiple people involved, it's time for one of them to come forward. And not that I'm cheering for anybody involved to get a deal, but the person who breaks and turns on the others is typically the one that gets the lightest sentence. Maybe you used to date or be married to one of these suspects, and they said something to you. If so, now is the time to come forward. I'll end with the words of Janet Cooke. She said, quote, "We have become victims almost as much as Rachel, and it hasn't been easy. But I'm not giving up as long as there's breath in my body." Rachel would be in her 40s if she were still alive today. At the time of her disappearance, she was 5'2" and 115 pounds. If you have any information, you can contact the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI or submit a tip online at tips.fbi.gov. Or you can contact the Williamson County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Team at 512-943-5204. This has been another episode of A Simpler Time True Crime. If you appreciate the work I'm doing, please leave a 5-star review on your preferred listening platform or any of your listening platforms. That really helps get the word out there, but even more so just telling your friends and sharing these episodes on social media. If you wish to support the show monetarily, I do have a Spreaker Supporters Club that you can find listed at the bottom of the show notes. And as always, thank you so much for listening, and join me again next Monday.